It's been 3 months since I switched to the M3 MacBook Air from the M3 Pro MacBook Pro, and after using it daily over that span, there's a lot worth discussing. During that time, I've been using the M3 Air for everything from productivity to coding and more creative workflows, both while at home and while traveling, and it's given me a fairly good idea of what to expect from it. Today, I want to dive into what that whole experience has been like, what the 2024 MacBook Air does great, what's maybe not so great, and just my general thoughts after using it every day that hopefully provide you with some value. It should at the very least give you a reference point if you're unsure if the M3 Air is going to work for you. So if that is the case, or if you just want to see what the last 4 months have looked like with my own use, stick around and let's get into it. This video is sponsored by Hyper. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. For the past few generations, I think the MacBook Air has been a pretty underrated laptop, and it's more capable than a lot of people give it credit for, which I think stems from a couple of things. One is the design. This is the thinnest MacBook available, it only has 2 ports, and it's fanless, which I think leads people to believe it's going to overheat or it's underpowered. And that really bleeds into the other main reason, which is the perception of lack of performance, especially with the base versions. The one that I have here is not the base version, and we're going to get into performance in a few minutes, but let's just come back to the design first. The version that I have here is the 13-inch model and is midnight in color. Apple says that there's a new anodization process on these to reduce fingerprints, but they still show up relatively easily. The good news is, it doesn't seem to be overly prone to wear. Around the USB-C ports, there's virtually no difference from when I got it new, even though these ports see a ton of use. Now, I'm pretty careful with my gear, and if you're hard on your laptops, that might be a different story, but I know for me, even when traveling, it's held up really well. I've taken this with me on both short and long trips, and with the Air coming in at 0.44 inches thick and weighing in at 2.7 pounds, it's about 28% thinner and 23% lighter than the 14-inch MacBook Pro, which is a little more convenient, but it does come with some trade-offs. The MacBook Air only has 2 USB-C ports, so you don't get the same versatility as the Pro with port selection, but I can probably count the times on one hand where that's been a pain point. For the most part, I'm just using this around the house or at my desk, and anytime it has been at my desk, it's in a vertical stand, plugged into a dock, and my studio display. The dock gives me all that I need in terms of SD, Thunderbolt, and USB-C ports, and it'll power the MacBook Air and all my accessories, the main being my external USB 4 NVMe SSD enclosure that I've had at my desk for the better part of a year, which just so happens to be made by this week's sponsor, Hyper. Their Hyperdrive USB 4 SSD enclosure combined with an NVMe drive like my Samsung 980 Pro gives me USB 4 and Thunderbolt speeds that often outperform the internal drive on my MacBook Air. On top of that, they have a Thunderbolt 4 hub that is really unique, which I am going to feature later on in another video, but the great thing about this is not only do you get 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports capable of 40 gigabit per second speeds, you've also got 96 watts power delivery that will power any MacBook, and the best part is there's no external power brick, which I've personally never seen before. All the Thunderbolt hubs or docks that I've seen, regardless of size, have a giant power brick attached to them, where this has an integrated GAN power source, so this is a lot easier to place or carry around with you if you're traveling. They also have a bunch of other great travel gear, all of which will be linked in the description, and right now if you use code HYPERKYLE15 at checkout, you can get 15% off anything here, so please check that out if you're interested because it's all great stuff. Now, one other thing that's related to the design that's often somewhat underrated is the display. The M3 MacBook Air has a liquid retina display in both the 13 and 15-inch models, which is an IPS backlit screen with a 60Hz refresh rate. So no mini LED ProMotion display like in the MacBook Pro, but in all honesty, it's still fantastic. The contrast ratio in my own testing far exceeds a standard IPS panel, and you get virtually no backlight bleed with great uniformity in color. I've edited a ton of photos and videos on this thing, and like all Apple products, it looks pretty much the same on this display as it does on an iPhone, iPad, studio display, you name it. Well, except maybe this thing. The point being, for the majority of people, even if you do have some advanced workflows, it's still more than capable. Speaking of video editing, that's probably what I've done the most of on here, just in terms of pushing the M3 Air to its limits. And that's where I want to start while getting into the performance side of things. So the configuration that I have here has 16 gigs of memory and a 512 gig SSD with an 8-core CPU and 10-core GPU. So this is a noticeable bump from the base model that comes with a 256 gig SSD, 8 gigs of memory, and 2 less GPU cores. I'm not going to sit here and talk about how the base version is useless and why no one should buy it, because I definitely think there is a place for it, especially for lighter use. I had the base 15-inch M2 Air for 6 months and was quite impressed with it for basic use, so don't sleep on it for basic things like productivity and consuming media. I got this particular config because this is what I would actually buy if it were just me looking for something as a consumer, considering everything that I would do with it. And a big part of me buying this was also to see how much I would notice the difference coming from the M3 Pro MacBook Pro, and the answer was not much. Working on these videos every week, everything feels virtually identical. I don't really notice any difference in terms of speed or processing power. The M3 Pro might be a little more snappy, say if I have a super long clip and I go to do some kind of heavy processing on it, but by and large, it hasn't felt like I've ever sacrificed anything. Sure, the Air does get warmer with a fanless design, but I've never noticed it throttle performance to the point where it's perceivable outside some niche GPU-heavy tasks. And there is a lot of chips that are ARM-based, like the M3, that don't use fans, so that's never really been a concern for me. Speaking of ARM, I did pre-order one of the new Microsoft Surface laptops that claim that they are better than the new MacBook Air for around the same price. So if you guys want to see how those stack up against each other, make sure that you're subscribed and drop a comment down below if there's anything that you would like to see between the Surface and the Air. Anyway, scrolling around the timeline and adding effects on the M3 feels indistinguishable compared to the M3 Pro, and because it is exactly the same encoding and decoding engine on both machines, export times are almost identical. Just a side note, one area I wonder about here is with memory usage, where if I'm working on my timeline for an extended period of time, I'll often get plugin crashes in Final Cut Pro, but if I restart, it doesn't seem to be an issue any longer. I don't recall this ever happening on my 32 gig memory desktop machines that I've had in the past, and it does happen on my MacBook Pro that has 18 gigs. I can't say for certain if that's a memory issue or what is going on there, but developers should be responsible for properly managing all of that anyway. And depending on what happens at WWDC this year, I might just completely move away from Final Cut. Outside of that though, things also feel very smooth with photo editing, graphic design, and coding. I know there might be outliers here with huge projects and batch processing, but regular usage is very snappy on the M3 Air, and working on a number of software projects of my own, both in web and mobile, things rarely ever lag. One area that I mentioned where there is a noticeable difference between the M3 Air and the M3 Pro MacBook Pro is when you start taxing the GPU, where apps like Blender feel a lot smoother and render much quicker on the M3 Pro. That's to be expected given the M3 Pro has a more powerful 14-core GPU, and you'll likely notice it with gaming or with plugins or visual effects that really lean into the GPU. But because the M3 introduced hardware-enabled ray tracing, apps that take advantage of it see pretty huge gains in performance over the previous generation, where I would say performance in the M3 Air is about on par with the M2 Pro. There are also a bunch of other specs on paper that make this seem like it's better or worse performance-wise that don't really make any difference. The M3 Air has 100 GB per second memory bandwidth that is much higher in other Pro and Max machines that I've never really noticed, and likewise, the SSD speed is quite a bit faster than the base M2 Air, and still a lot slower than the M3 Pro, but I have honestly never really noticed a difference between any of these machines and SSD speed while actually using them. That's why I run most of my workflow from an external SSD. I remember years ago getting my first M1 Pro machine thinking that importing and working with large files while video editing would be a noticeable improvement on the internal drive versus the external one that I had at the time, and it ended up feeling almost exactly the same. So while I do like to bump up the spec to around 512 gigs minimum, just to give myself enough room to comfortably work around macOS, I generally prefer to keep that lower and just work from an external drive to bring the cost down a little bit and reduce the mileage on the internal drive. Keep in mind that I am using this mostly at home though, and I can totally understand why you wouldn't want to haul around an external SSD if you're a lot more nomadic. But I think the main point to be aware of here is just that SSD speeds on any of these Macs is rarely ever going to be a bottleneck, and I don't think that that should be a deciding factor for purchasing any of these. One thing that is a reasonable factor for a lot of people will be battery life, and the M3 Air has been great in that regard. This, like every other new MacBook, will get you through a full workday no problem and then some, and that hasn't really changed since I did my initial review. I've taken this on trips with me where I've been gone for a week, and I've only had to charge it once or twice with light use. And while the Pro does last a little bit longer than this, it's still outstanding. Now, if you start running this at 100% CPU or GPU usage, that's going to fall down much quicker, and you'll likely want to have some kind of power brick or external power bank handy, and you're probably looking at more like a half day of battery life, but I don't know how often you're going to tax things that much. And it's still more than acceptable in my opinion. One question I do get a lot of with people seeing this sitting at my desk in a vertical stand plugged in all the time is if I have to worry about that killing the battery or if I notice any degradation there. And that really hasn't been an issue on any of the Macs that I've owned since the M series came out. I had the M2 MacBook Air at my desk for about a year and I rarely ever unplugged it, and it was still completely fine after that year. macOS does a really good job with power management these days, so that isn't really something that I worry about anymore, nor should anyone else. Overall, there really isn't anything over the last 4 months with this machine that I felt disappointed with, other than maybe not having an SD card or something like that while traveling, but outside of minor annoyances like those, this is a super solid machine. It's done everything completely fine in my workflow, whether that's making these videos, coding, photo editing, or graphic design, you name it. As far as software goes, I'm mostly doing front-end web and mobile development on here, and if you need to set up VMs or have really complex projects with software, or with 3D models for that matter, you're probably going to want to step things up and get yourself something more powerful, but for 95% of people, the M3 MacBook Air is likely all that you're gonna need. It will be interesting to see what the new Snapdragon X Elite chips are like in these new Microsoft Copilot Plus machines like the Surface laptop, especially considering there doesn't seem to be a new Mac on the horizon for a little while, so I am really interested to see how they'll stack up against the MacBook Air. That being said, I don't think that you can go wrong with the Air, and if you have one yourself, let me know in the comments down below how it's working out for you and what you're using it for. That's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video or you found it useful. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more tech-related content or help me develop a robotic pet that insists on teaching people about the Roman Empire, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.